Professor Yvonne Galligan. Yvonne, it's so wonderful to have you back with us in Queen's today. And you were involved with QGI and gender equality work in Queen's really right from the beginning. But I wonder if you could think back to when you became the second director of QGI. And at that time, the unit was quite established, but yet there were probably significant challenges that had to be faced. And I wonder if you could share some of your objectives as director for QGI at that time.
Thanks, Karen. And yes, you're right, I was involved from the very beginning, or almost the very beginning, when I came to Queen's in 2000 to head up at the Centre for Advancement of Women in Politics. And then I was invited by Brenda to become part of the Women's Forum and Queen's Gender Initiative. And following it through was really interesting. And it was amazing to watch Brenda and Margaret progress gender equality initiatives in the university over the years that they were involved. And so when I took over in 2009, I had a sense that I was coming in to fill a very big space and very big shoes. And I was very conscious of the legacy that they had left. And I certainly didn't want to disappoint them and to let down the institution in taking on the role as second director of QGI. And I quickly got to understand that that the success of QGI had almost led to a mindset in Queen's that the women's problem was sorted because QGI had been so successful to that point in time. And in fact, it wasn't really sorted. In fact, we were only beginning to address many of the issues in a deeper way than we had previously been able to. And one process was, of course, through broadening the Athena Swan accreditation right across the university, not just into the STEM schools, but also into arts, humanities and social sciences. And that was a huge task in its own right, a huge task internally, but also there was a journey to be gone with the Equality Challenge Unit, as it was at the time, to be part of the thinking with the Equality Challenge Unit around extending Athena Swan into the areas that were not previously covered by it. So that was a big conversation that took place. The other thing that happened was that as Athena Swan became more and more successful, and Queen's have been hugely successful in Athena Swan, there was a sense that gender equality was all about Athena Swan, when in actual fact gender equality is a much more complex agenda with many more facets and dimensions to it, including policy development, for example. So one of the initiatives that I undertook was having recognised in the promotions process that women's maternity breaks would be considered as part of the profile, the normal profile of an academic career, and that women would not be penalised because they had taken family leave during the course of their careers. And right now that seems as if it's a very obvious thing to do, but back then around 2009, 2010 it wasn't. And it was something that had to be teased out within the university and something that had to be accepted by not just policymakers, but also people who were applying for promotion and people who were on the promotions panels, to understand that because women took time out of their careers didn't mean that they weren't serious about their academic careers. The other important thing at that point, I thought, was to to make women's achievements visible in the sense of having role models and having a whole speaker series with presenting women role models, women at the top of their academic careers and professions, women with national and international and global reputations, bringing them to Queen's and enabling everybody to hear them. And we did that on many occasions. And we always tried, Queen's Gender Initiative, always tried to have two sessions. One was the public event, which was open to everybody and was very well attended. All of them were very well attended. The other one was a private tea with the speaker. So, and there it was women who were part of the Women's Forum or Queen's Gender Initiative, or interested women, swan champions, women that were working around gender equality initiatives, whether they were academics or whether they were in professional support services. Mm-hmm. They were invited to this much more intimate gathering where there could be a very open conversation in a very safe space. And I think a lot of women benefited from that small gathering that took place out of the limelight of the big open event. Because as you know, Karen, when you have big open events and the question and answer comes to the end, often women feel a little bit hesitant to be the first person to ask a question at these events. And we felt that this was a way of redressing that particular obstacle to women having their voices heard. That was one thing that I was really very keen on, was for women's voices to be heard and for women to feel that they could make their voices heard. And that was part and parcel of this seminar series of speakers, which then morphed into conferences on women's leadership.
And really this set of initiatives and really personal goals that you brought as director has given many women and their male colleagues access to role models from public life, from their academic field, thought leaders in different areas. And with access to role models, enabling conversations, and those conversations that are in private can really allow people to find their own voice within their school, their faculty, and also as Queens, as we impact society around us, and the partnerships with the non-university sector, both in Northern Ireland and abroad, has taken the vision of QGI, which was initially looking at ourselves within Queens and thinking about the progression and the participation of women within our community, but actually really enabling similar conversations to be had elsewhere. And this sharing of knowledge with each other and sharing of policies and practices and culture change outside of Queens, that beacon activity is something that I think QGI has been leading the way and reaching out and developing partnerships. You referenced Athena Swan, which is a huge part of everything you've described, and your work in QGI and the personal interactions with colleagues through arts, humanities, social sciences, bringing that community along with champions from the STEM schools, inspired a new generation of women in Queens who became members of self-assessment teams, spearheading gender equality, International Women's Day in their own areas. And I guess that's been a very rewarding part of your role, having the personal interactions with individuals who have gone on to do work within schools, impacting their students, impacting their trainee researchers and so on.
Absolutely, Karen, it really has. That has been a very satisfying part of the role, and that remains with me today. I think one of the big successes of that was in developing the Swan Champions Network in Queens. And that did bring together both women and men who were really leading Athena Swan and gender equality in the wider sense within their schools, brought all of those together. It was, and I don't know if it still is, but I imagine it is, quite an informal network. But in meeting regularly, in having a forum to discuss the challenges that they were facing in terms of addressing gender equality issues within their schools, it gave them a chance to share information, to support one another, and also, as time went on, to articulate the asks they had of their schools or their faculty or the university as a whole, which was a really very good thing to have in place, because I felt that these were the people on the ground living the experience that we were trying to influence and trying to change. And their lived experience contributed immeasurably to enriching the quality of the actions and the processes that we in the wider university adopted or recognised or in some way facilitated. And there was there were great friendships formed in that group that I think remain there to this day. And it was also an avenue for women and supportive men to find their own leadership role. And I think as time went on, that leadership role became more and more recognised in the sense of it being part of their job and being recognised for it through different mechanisms. And I think it was very empowering for them too. And that's what I always wanted to achieve. I wanted to empower women and supportive men to deliver on gender equality, because you can have the best policy in the world, but if it's not believed in and if it's not implemented and if it's not put into practice, then there's no point in having the best policy in the world.
And we would always say that there would be no Athena Swan programme in Queen's without our champions. And equally, gender equality in Queen's would not be where it is without this highly effective group of people who come together every 4 to 6 weeks outside of the pandemic. They would share lunch and they would share experiences. And yes, the conversations could be informal, but the impacts often were within the structures and policies and the implementation of policies. I've been part of this network for quite a number of years, and one person and one person's voice gets amplified around the table. And that voice does get articulated into a movement for change, whether that's within the workload allocation model and how we recognise roles like that of our champions and equivalent roles as being part of a mainstream day job, not something interesting that gets fitted in around other equally important parts of the day job. And I think the growth of the role of the Swan Champion, that this is now recognised. People aspire to take on these roles, and they know that through this is one way of developing their own leadership. And we felt it's important for us in QGI to support that development and to provide opportunities for those who are involved in this work to get involved in things like media training and all of the work that really helps them to articulate key messages that are impacting the next generation of academics, the next generation of the professionals that come out of our university who started off as our students. And I think the impacts have got both horizontal and vertical dimensions.
Can I just come back on
Please
that?
do.
I think that's really interesting, the points that you raise. I think the important thing to remember, in my view, about the Athena Swan Network is that it is not just an instrument for developing better equality practices. Its value, in my view, is as a critical voice, as people who are in the university see what's wrong and want to fix it, but are not afraid to say what is wrong. And that critical, challenging voice is what keeps the equality agenda alive and fresh. And so I wouldn't like anyone to think that this group of people were just kind of implementing things at all. Absolutely not. Mm-hmm. And I began, as time went on, I valued more and more their critical voice. And the Athena Swan network, when it was led by Susan Clark, now it's led by many, many people, but I remember Susan really encouraging that critical perspective. And it was a constructive critical perspective because, you know, these difficult conversations need to be had. Uncomfortable truths need to be faced when it comes to gender equality questions. And Susan was able to bring that out in the group, while also very pragmatically knowing what could be achieved and what needed to be parked for a little while before it could be returned to and worked on at a later stage.
That's really important, and I've observed our Swan champions shining a light on areas of inequality or areas of potential inequality. And as we know, during things like a pandemic, inequalities can get amplified. And our Swan champions, very, very early on, were anticipating where this might go. When there was the lockdown, research was being stalled, programs were being paused, people were at home. Those with caring responsibilities were doing what we call the juggle struggle, the double shift and so on. But our Swan champions were really having the conversation of what would happen next, and really what, as a university, we would have to start thinking about and implementing so that a COVID penalty would not develop in people's careers. And they anticipated this would particularly impact many of our women. Mm-hmm. I'm really glad that you've raised that point, because it's not about implementing a policy that's come from afar. It is very much organic, and it's being responsive on the ground to needs that are developing that we may not have thought about 21 years ago, but being sufficiently flexible and adaptable in sensing and in bringing about change.
Mm-hmm. Very true, absolutely, Karen. And there is, as you say, a vital role for networks of that kind. You're quite right. As you're speaking, one of the things that occurred to me was that the Athena Swan Champions Network sat alongside another activity that I think has had a huge impact and certainly was developed during my time as Director of Queen's Gender Initiative. And that was the Queen's Mentoring Programme, which was begun by Margaret and Brenda and Madeleine Ennis and all those amazing people that were there at the start. When I became a director, it had been hugely successful, and there was a question mark over whether it was needed any longer. So with Jane Garvey from the Equal Opportunities Unit, we undertook a piece of research to demonstrate the beneficial effects of the mentoring program. And we were able to show that women who went through the mentoring program were more likely to progress more rapidly in their careers than a control group of women who had not taken part in the mentoring program. And so on the basis of that, we were able to argue for the resources to continue it, which was really very important. But then two more wonderful women came along and began to develop it and extend it even further. So Maria Lohan and Denise Price really took that agenda and developed it in many different ways with mentoring programs for women at different stages of their careers. And I think that also brought a whole new dimension to mentoring that I think has benefited women and queens in the longer term. One of our challenges was that women comprised 22% of the professoriate. And it was stuck at 22% for such a long time. And to try and get movement on this, the three of us thought that maybe extending the mentoring program to different levels might help. I think it probably has, because I think the proportion of women in the professoriate is now closer to 30% than closer to 20%, which is a great achievement. But there's still a long way to go, I would say. Karen, I think that's your challenge.
I think you're right.
But not only yours, it's the university's challenge, in fact. But one cannot, again, downplay the importance of the mentoring program.
We've heard so much from participants in the mentoring program that both as mentees and also those as mentors will say that those conversations, that they're confidential, but having the opportunity to reflect on someone's career allows mentors to reflect internally on their own careers and their own objectives. And many of our mentors will say, yes, I gave back to the program, but I got so much in return. And I think the holistic and the bespoke nature of QGI's mentoring program and its objectives continues to benefit women, continues to support people who are setting the direction of their own careers, but they're getting insights from people who build up that 360-degree view. I often say that I don't normally have opportunity to see the back of my own head, but a mentor can. And a mentor can really shine a light on blind spots, and I think we can never underestimate the importance of people who speak into our lives, and it remains a very important objective of QGI, and particularly of its third director.
That's great to hear. That's absolutely wonderful. In thinking about this also, I'm reminded that the chairperson of QGI, who worked most closely with me on this issue, was Sheila Fleming. And Sheila Fleming really supported this issue of mentoring women, and also supported hugely the issue of visibility and role models and women in leadership. And she was hugely supportive in terms of that agenda, as was Patricia Gordon, who preceded her in that role, both of them coming from outside of the university but being part of Senate, and seeing the value of what we were doing in QGI. Both of them gave their full support to everything that we were doing.
Absolutely, and I think the external voice is very important, and the QGI mentoring program just this last year has expanded to bring in some of our alumni as mentors, speaking into the program and also within mentoring partnerships with colleagues across Queen's, which is it's just fantastic to have that external perspective. And I'm so glad you referenced the work of Sheila. And I remember Sheila chairing the QGI Executive Committee, and her wisdom and insight that we would get snippets of as she was chairing, I think we've all taken a lot from. In reflecting over the last 10 years where you've been director of QGI, and really the huge implementation of work across all of the faculties and schools, and the hearts and minds piece as well as the policy piece, have you got any advice you could share with us thinking back, I wish I'd known this particular thing back then? Is there anything comes to mind?
I think I would say that it's okay to meet obstacles and be comfortable when you do meet them. I think that's what I've learned, and that's what I would say to people, that gender equality work is not a smooth path at all. And one never knows where the resistance or the barrier to change is going to come. And it's a matter of not worrying about it when it does appear, but reflecting on it and trying to understand where it is coming from, what is causing it. And it could be a personal, it could be expressed in personal terms, it could be expressed in procedural terms, it could be expressed as a reluctance to implement a piece of the system. You know, changing systems is always a big thing in universities. But there's always an underlying reason for the obstacle. And understanding what the reason is often a way to unblocking it and to finding a solution. So I would say to anybody in the role or in the position today, I would say, don't worry about encountering obstacles. They're a signal that something needs to change. Mm-hmm. And it's up to the individual then to find out, well, what is the key that's going to unlock that change?
I think we might have to have a podcast at a later date, Yvonne, on identifying, embracing, understanding and unlocking the obstacles and seeing that as a positive thing. Very wise words indeed. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your reflections and also your words of wisdom. It's been a pleasure talking with you today, Yvonne. Thank you.
You're very welcome, Karen. It's been a pleasure for me too.
Thank you.